I am the hat that hid the creative fury of an erupting mind, Ludwig van Beethoven. I was born in the skilled hands of a Vienna hatter in the summer of 1802. Fashioned from dark felt with a wide, practical brim, I was not the most elegant of my kind, but I was sturdy and dependable. Little did I know then that I would come to rest upon the most turbulent mind of the century. The first time he held me, I felt the tremble in his fingers. Ludwig van Beethoven examined me with scrutiny, turning me over several times before nodding with approval. His thick, wild hair seemed to have a life of its own, and I wondered if I could ever tame such unruly locks. His eyes, though deep and intense, spoke of a storm brewing within. "This will do," he muttered to the shopkeeper, "a good companion for my walks." I was wrapped in paper and carried to a modest apartment on the Mölkerbastei in Vienna's center. The rooms were in disarray. Papers scattered everywhere, half-eaten meals forgotten on tables, instruments in various states of use or neglect. The chaos of his external world mirrored something profound within him, something I would come to understand intimately in the years ahead. That first night, as I rested on a hook by the door, I heard him at his piano. The music came in furious bursts, then halted abruptly. He would mutter, curse, scratch notes on paper, then begin again. Sometimes he would press his ear against the wood of the instrument, as if desperately trying to capture every vibration. It was only later I learned what the servants whispered about. The great composer was losing his hearing. The sound that defined his existence was slipping away, note by precious note. The irony was cruel and unbearable. That night, I witnessed him slam his fists down on the keys in frustration, then bury his face in his hands. In the morning, he reached for me, with purpose. "Come," he said, though not to me, but to himself. "The melody will not find me here." And so began our first journey together. As he placed me upon his head, I felt it immediately. The heat of his thoughts, the maelstrom of notes swirling beneath me. I was not merely covering a head, I was sheltering a universe of sound that struggled to be born, even as silence encroached upon its creator. With each step into the Vienna streets, I sensed his posture change, his face set with determination. The world saw only a brooding man in a wide-brimmed hat. They couldn't know I was cradling the very lightning of creation itself. The rhythm of his walk was like no other, sometimes brisk with excitement, other times plodding with the weight of his thoughts. Our walks became longer through 1803 and 1804 as his hearing deteriorated further and his social engagements dwindled. I became his constant companion along the paths of the Prater Gardens and through the Vienna woods. The solitude suited him, and it suited me to witness his process. On a crisp autumn morning in 1804, we ventured beyond the city limits to the Heiligenstadt district, where he had written his sorrowful testament just 2 years prior, a letter never sent, confessing his despair over his increasing deafness. The air carried the scent of falling leaves as we followed the Danube's winding course. Beneath me, his mind was anything but peaceful. I could feel the vibrations of his humming, discordant, searching, often interrupted by him stopping suddenly to scribble in a small notebook he carried. These moments were sacred. I learned to recognize the birth of something monumental. That day, fragments of what would become his third symphony, the Eroica, were taking shape. "No, no, no," he muttered, crossing out notes violently. "Stronger! It must begin with strength." His fingers drummed against my brim, keeping time with invisible measures only he could hear. Sometimes we would walk for hours without rest. The physical movement seemed to unlock something in him. When rain threatened, he pulled me lower over his brow, but rarely turned back. The elements were no match for his determination. We would return to his lodgings with me soaked through, but his pockets filled with musical ideas. I felt most needed during the summer of 1806 in Döbling, when the violin concerto in D was tormenting him. So many times he would stop beneath a linden tree, remove me from his head, and stare into my hollow center as if the solution to a musical puzzle might be found there. Then he would sigh, replace me, and continue, only to halt again 50 paces later with a triumphant, "Aha!" His body would tense with excitement, and I could almost feel the melody flowing through him. What the world never saw were his moments of quiet vulnerability, how sometimes he would remove me and press his palms against his ears, desperate to hear the birds or the rustling leaves, how his eyes would moisten when a melody from a street musician reached him only as a muffled shadow of sound. In these moments, I wished I could offer more than mere shelter from sun and rain. I wished I could preserve for him the sounds that were fading from his world. Winter of 1808 arrived with unusual severity. The cold made his joints ache, yet still we ventured out, my felt now worn thinner at the edges. Inside his apartment on Theatre an der Wien, where he now resided, the Fifth Symphony was consuming him. I watched from my peg as he paced at night, striking his forehead as if to knock loose the notes trapped within. "Fate knocking at the door," he said once, playing those famous 4 notes repeatedly. "Can you hear it?" he asked the empty room. "Fate knocking, but I shall not answer." By this time, conversation horns and ear trumpets littered his rooms, desperate attempts to capture fragments of sound. But on our walks, he carried no such devices. Instead, he relied on me to shield him from curious stares as he conducted invisible orchestras with his free hand, oblivious to the bewildered glances of passers-by. On a January morning, we were caught in a snowstorm near the Belvedere Palace. Most people sought shelter, but Ludwig seemed to draw energy from the swirling white chaos. He removed me suddenly, holding me out as if offering me to the storm itself. Snowflakes gathered in my hollow, melting slowly, while snow dusted his wild hair and bushy eyebrows. "This," he exclaimed, "this is what the transition in the 4th movement should feel like. Unexpected, overwhelming, then gradually transforming." He replaced me on his head and hurried home, snow crunching beneath his boots. That night, by candlelight, the passage was completed. By 1809, as Napoleon's forces surrounded Vienna, his world became increasingly confined to the landscape of his mind. The bombing of Vienna in May shook the city, but affected him less than the bombing silence in his ears. We huddled in a cellar with his patron, Countess Erdödy, while he pressed pillows against his ears, not to block the cannon fire, but to stop the painful ringing that plagued him. When we emerged days later, parts of the city lay in ruins. As we walked through the aftermath, I felt his pace slow at the sight of a destroyed piano workshop. He stood motionless before the splintered instruments, his hand reaching up to touch my brim as if to steady himself. That evening, he began sketching what would become the Emperor Concerto, a defiant answer to destruction, a monument to resilience. I witnessed his quill moving frantically across the page, occasionally pausing only when he needed to warm his ink by the fire. Through the night he worked, and I understood then that as his outer world grew quieter, the symphony within him only grew more magnificent. By 1814, I had weathered considerably. My once sharp brim now sagged slightly, and my color had faded from deep black to a muted charcoal. Ludwig himself had changed too. At 44, his face had grown fuller, his movements less impetuous but no less determined. His fame had spread throughout Europe, yet his isolation deepened as his hearing retreated to near total silence. Our walks now included a small notebook tied with string that hung from his coat button, what his friends called his conversation book. When someone wished to speak with him during our outings, they would write their words, and he would respond in his thunderous voice, often unmodulated as he could no longer hear himself. We walked the same paths in the Vienna woods, but with different purpose. These walks were no longer merely for inspiration, they were his sanctuary from a world he could no longer fully inhabit. Under my brim, his eyes sought solace in nature that his ears could no longer provide. The rustling leaves, the singing birds, all now performed in a theatre of silence. One autumn day in 1815 near Baden, we encountered a shepherd boy playing a simple flute. Ludwig stopped abruptly. I felt his body tense beneath me. He approached, the startled boy, and gestured for the instrument. The child, recognizing the famous composer, hesitantly handed it over. Ludwig placed it to his lips and blew, but could not hear the note he produced. The boy's confused expression told enough. He returned the flute with a sad smile and placed me back on his head, pulling my brim lower as we continued our walk. That evening, he began sketching his song cycle, An die ferne Geliebte, to the distant beloved. I witnessed the irony as he composed songs he would never hear performed, expressing a longing not just for love, but for the world of sound that had become his distant beloved. The conversation books multiplied over the years. Sometimes on our walks he would suddenly stop and page through previous conversations, as if trying to recapture moments of connection now fading from memory. Once, near the Danube in 1817, a sudden rain shower soaked one such book. I watched, his distress as the ink ran, erasing words already spoken, much as his memory of voices was eroding with time. Yet beneath me I felt no diminishment of the creative fire. If anything, as his isolation grew, so too did the boldness of his musical ideas. The compositions became more intricate, more profound, as if in losing the distraction of the outer world, he had gained unprecedented access to some deeper musical truth. I sheltered not a diminished man, but one whose inner symphony played with ever-increasing grandeur. The winter of 1822 was brutally cold in Vienna. My felt had grown thin in places, patched clumsily by Ludwig himself, who had little patience for such practical matters. Yet he refused to replace me. We had traversed too many miles together, weathered too many storms, both literal and metaphorical. By this time, Ludwig was completely deaf. The conversation books were his only link to the spoken world. Our walks had become more laborious as gout and digestive ailments plagued him, but still, we ventured out almost daily, often to the Hellenental Valley near Baden. It was during one such walk in April 1822 that I felt a different energy beneath me. For months, perhaps years, an idea had been fermenting, something unprecedented, a symphony that would transcend all he had composed before. As we followed a path alongside a brook, he suddenly stopped and looked upward, as if receiving a message. From the sky itself, his hand reached for his pocket notebook and began scribbling frantically. I felt the movement of his arm jostling me slightly. What emerged on those pages were the first definitive sketches of what would become the Ninth Symphony's Ode to Joy theme. A melody of such simplicity and power that it would one day become an anthem for humanity itself. We stood there for nearly an hour, oblivious to other walkers who passed with curious glances at the disheveled man in the worn hat, conducting silently to himself. Once the idea was secured on paper, he patted my brim as if in gratitude and whispered, "At last, at last." The work consumed him for the next 2 years. Our walks became more urgent, as if he were racing against time itself. Often, he would return to the same spots where inspiration had struck, hoping to recapture the moment. Near the ruins of Rauhenstein Castle in the summer of 1823, he paced back and forth for hours, muttering about the structure of the final movement. "Voices," he said aloud, startling a nearby bird. "The symphony must have voices at the end. Instruments alone cannot express this joy." The decision was revolutionary. A chorus in a symphony. I felt his excitement as he hurried back to his lodgings. That day, barely noticing the gathering storm clouds, we arrived home drenched, but he paid no mind, rushing to his desk to continue the work that would become his crowning achievement. As 1824 approached, his health deteriorated further. Our walks grew shorter, sometimes limited to just a few blocks, before exhaustion overtook him. Yet beneath me, his mind remained as active as ever, adding final touches to the immense score that would soon astonish Vienna, and eventually the world. The premiere of the Ninth Symphony on May 7, 1824, at the Count Nator Theatre in Vienna, marked one of the last times Ludwig wore me in public. By then, I was so worn and unfashionable that his friends had tried to convince him to purchase a new hat for the occasion. He refused vehemently. "This hat knows my music better than anyone," he growled through a conversation book. "It has been present at the birth of every note." I was placed carefully on a chair in the conductor's room as he prepared for the performance. Though officially another conductor led the orchestra, Ludwig stood on stage to provide tempos. He could not hear a single note of his masterpiece. When the final chord sounded and the audience erupted in applause, he remained facing the orchestra, unaware of the reaction, until someone turned him around to see the 5 standing ovations, handkerchiefs and hats waving in the air. Our walks became increasingly rare after that triumph. By the winter of 1826, he was largely confined to his bed at his nephew Karl's home in the Schwarzspanjer house. I rested on a hook nearby, gathering dust, but never forgotten. Occasionally, his gaze would find me, and a faint smile would cross his lips, as if remembering our countless journeys together. On March 26, 1827, as a violent thunderstorm raged over Vienna, Ludwig van Beethoven took his final breath. Among the items in the room was a small table with his most treasured possessions. A lock of hair meant for a woman he had loved from afar, a portrait of Haydn, his pocket watch and me, his faithful wide-brimmed hat, now misshapen and faded, but still bearing the invisible imprint of the tempest of creativity I had sheltered for so many years. I was inherited by his nephew, then passed through various hands over the decades. Now I rest in a museum display case under careful lighting that prevents further deterioration. Visitors pass by daily, reading the small placard that identifies me as Beethoven's walking hat, circa 1802-1827. What they cannot read is the true story, how I was not merely an accessory, but a silent witness to genius. I sheltered not just a man, but a revolution in music. Beneath my brim fermented the ideas that would break the boundaries of what music could express, ideas that continue to resonate in concert halls around the world nearly 2 centuries later. Was just a simple hat, crafted by anonymous hands, but I held the most complex mind of a generation. In my hollow lived momentarily the notes that would bring both tears and transcendent joy to millions yet unborn. Though I am now still and silent, the music that was born beneath me plays on, eternal, magnificent, human. Every time the ode to joy rings out across the world, I remember the troubled brow I once protected and the extraordinary mind that, even in silence, taught humanity how to listen,